Hi.
Hi.
It already says it's recording.
I know. Oh, well.
How do we get on before Erin?
I don't know. So you're at home. Yeah. When do you go to the cottage?
Sunday, because Saturday is Oliver's birthday party.
Oh, where?
At Rick's house, Auntie's dad.
Oh, how nice.
Yeah, except that it's supposed to rain all day and it's a pool party.
Oh no.
Anyway, it'll be fun. It's sort of like the last party that Rick and you get are having because they're selling their house.
Oh, are they moving into an apartment?
They're moving into an upper duplex. Huguette's daughter owns a duplex and she lives downstairs and they're renovating the upstairs for them.
Oh.
Yeah.
Nearby?
No, they're in Montreal East.
They've got oh, that's too bad. That's so far away.
Well, the thing is that if something happens to Rick, Huguette will live right near her family.
Yes.
Yeah. So.
Yeah.
So where's our teacher?
I don't know.
I'm so upset it's the last class. I'm enjoying this so much.
Yeah. Yeah, it's wonderful.
Yeah. Now are you going to go to a museum next week when you see
I know. I don't want them to get tired out.
Well, they want, but Erin said she wanted.
I'm going to keep it easy. And Museum of Nature is 10 minutes away. It'll be exhausting. They check into the hotel, they do some swimming, they have dinner, they get over to this site.
Hi. Gwen's very concerned about you getting very, very tired next week in Ottawa.
Before the show. So
we'll be okay.
There's so much to do.
If anything, we'll take a power nap.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Hi, Gary. You're on mute. All right.
Now, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Oh, well, I'm as my granddaughter says, I'm pretty stupid. I don't know how to use a cell phone or a computer. She's 12. And you know what? She's right.
No, honestly, it's like a generational thing. It's like the younger you are these days, the better you are at technology. Right. It's very weird, you would think that you gain wisdom.
Well, we gain wisdom. We just don't know how to display it, or like my 94-year-old friend Rita, like she can still remember phone numbers.
Recording. There we go. Okay. Stop video. Okay, so here we go. So if you remember from last week, we ended off with Françoise Sullivan. She was one of the automatist artists from Montreal, and she was sort of multi-practicing artist. We saw that she did some sculpture, and then she did some performances, some dance performances, and then she moved towards kinetic sculpture. And then this was the last piece that we looked at by her, which was a performance piece where she walked in between the Museum of Contemporary Art and the Museum of Fine Arts and took a picture on every corner to document what happens inside and outside of the museums. That's where we left off. So I had said that we had one more of Les Automatistes that I wanted to have a look at, and that was Marcel Ferrand. So Marcel Ferrand was a Quebecoise painter and stained glass artist. She was a major figure in Quebec contemporary, older contemporary art scene associated with Les Automatistes. She is one of the dominant figures in the history of Canadian stained glass. And she participated in all of the Automaticist group exhibitions, including the critically acclaimed retrospective Bordua et les Automatistes at the Grand Palais de Paris in 1971. Her work was exhibited in numerous collective exhibitions, both Europe and the US, as well as at the Louvre. So this is from the this is from the University of Concordia, and it was donation from the Canadian Jewish Congress. So this was a piece that she did to commemorate all of the Jews lost during the Second World War. A beautiful piece that stands quite tall, as you can see. And she worked in a kind of abstract way with stained glass, as we will see. And she had a really interesting technique that she used. Her experiments with glass have resulted in a style of glass panel that can be incorporated into any construction design: private homes, public buildings and monuments, churches and temples, industrial complexes. Examples of her work can be admired, as we will see, at the Champ de Mars and Vendôme metro stations, and the International Aviation Building, all in Montreal, as well as Place du Portage in Hull and the courthouse in Granby, which we'll see a couple of these examples. She trained at École des Beaux-Arts de Québec and l'École du Meuble in Montreal under Bordua. And in 1961, she won the silver medal at the Sao Paulo Biennale, as well as the Paul-Émile Bordua Prize in 1983, among others. So just a little excerpt. To symbolize the atrocity, this Holocaust memorial has an abstract, multicolored design that shows the denigration of each letter of the word shalom, meaning peace in Hebrew. Ferrand commented that the red glass surrounding the broken letters represents fire, and the upper section provides a sun of hope. A lightning bolt connects the two sections, and the color becomes lighter as the design moves upwards. Here we have a selection from inside the Granby courthouse. So this is her piece. It's untitled, but it is installed, as you can see, it's written on 3 floors of the east side of the courthouse. So it's basically the entire facade of the courthouse east side. Quite gorgeous. And as you can see, I mean, in the bits of the floor that you can see, the colors reflect onto the floor and onto like the pillars and the walls. So it really makes it not just a stained glass installation, but it becomes like an immersive experience inside because of all the color reflections. So this is at the Champ de Mars. So if you look at like the squares of glass that she's used, it's a really interesting technique that she has. And this too is quite massive. So this is a major work in the history of public art in Quebec. It's a large non-figurative glass roof by Ferrand. And of all the works that adorn Montreal metro stations, it is this canopy that is the best known. During the day, the sun's rays reflect its dazzling color on the station's platforms, and at night, the interior lighting projects them outside the kiosk, inevitably attracting the gaze of the passers-by. If you've ever seen this, it's quite remarkable to go into the Champ de Mars. I mean, Montreal metro stations, a lot of them have really interesting, tile designs or like floor tile designs or wall designs, but this one I find is the most special. It was inaugurated on July 6, 1968, which was actually before its installation was completed. So you'll see, like, as I mentioned with the panels that she does. So what the technique is that she uses, and I don't know for how much of the entire installation it was, but like one of the things that she does with her work is that she takes old, like antique pieces of stained glass and inserts them in between two panels of regular glass, and then poses them to create the structure. So the stained glass is it's not just a stained glass window, it's glass inside glass. And now we move to the Painters 11. So as I mentioned before, this section, we first went to like Alfred Pellan, and then we went to to talk about abstraction and the kind of dynamic between Pellan and Bourdieu, and how there was always this kind of tension. And so the dynamic, the relationship between Pellan's school and his students and his school of thought and Bourdieu and les automatistes was kind of like a rivalry in Quebec during this time. But outside of Quebec, when we think of abstract art and abstract expressionism, we think of the Painters 11. So in 1953, 11 abstract painters from Ontario, as they're listed here, dubbed themselves Painters 11 and held their first exhibition at Roberts Gallery in Toronto in 1954. The exhibition was arranged by Jack Bush and was the first major commercial exhibition of abstract expressionist art in Toronto. Unlike the group of seven whose members' work evolved along parallel lines, Painters 11 did not share a common artistic vision as a group apart from a commitment to abstraction. This was reflected in the diversity of the group's members. Decades separated youngest from eldest, and before they sold their paintings, they made their living as freelance commercial artists who worked in advertising and as teachers. As I had mentioned last week, this kind of came about from the paintings being juxtaposed next to modern furniture in a window of like the department store. And because it got such a good return and good reaction from the public, they then said to themselves, okay, let's try and organize an exhibition. So it was this exhibition that they organized. So in Canada's conservative art world, their first exhibition was met with confusion and kind of disdain, which is pretty typical when it comes to new art movements throughout history. And it's ironic because there was such great reaction from the storefront window. So people saw it as like matching the furniture type thing, but when they were posed in a way to take it as serious artwork, then the public took it a little bit differently. So here, we're not going to look at every single one of them, but I chose some of every different kind of like style and examples of that would give you an idea of what they sort of represented as a group. So this is Jack Bush Bonnet, and I understand that abstract expressionism is an acquired taste and not everybody enjoys it or quote unquote gets it, but we're going to go through some. And if at any point you want to make comments or you have questions, feel free. So as a young man in Toronto in the 1930s, Bush ran a commercial art business and took night classes at the Ontario College of Art. During this period, he had very little exposure to modern European art, and like most other Toronto painters at the time, was primarily influenced by the group of seven. The decorative designs and areas of flat color of Toronto-based artist and designer Charles Comfort was also one of Bush's influences in his early painting career. After seeing abstract art in Toronto and New York, Bush began to experiment with abstraction himself in the 1950s. As you can see, this one is from 1961, so it had been about 10 years that he had been working in abstract. Bush is actually one of the most familiar of the Painters 11 to the British audience. His work is in the Tate Modern, and he regularly exhibited with the Waddington Galleries in London. In 1980, 3 years after his death at the age of 68, the Arts Council of Great Britain circulated an exhibition of 87 works to venues in London, Edinburgh, and Birmingham. So interesting how different areas of the world, different countries, different audiences have different tastes. And so he just happened to be very popular among the British public. So you can see from the title, Bonnet, you know, this would be an abstraction of a person. You know, the clothing would be the white part, the bonnet would be the blue with some kind of like feathers or adornment, which would be the green part. And I'm guessing that the pink area might be a purse. This is a tight sash. So Bush had a habit of not just painting from his feelings, but of painting his feelings out. When he was unhappy with his superiors at his job in commercial art, when a valued colleague and friend like Oscar Kahn, who's one of the Painters 11 as well, died, or when his heart and then his liver were troubling him later in his years, he used painting as a means of therapy. In the most successful instances, the initial distress the artist felt has been so transformed that only the merest residue of it remains. After Bush's chest pains were diagnosed as angina, he chose a crescent shape to stand for them. So we don't really see the crescent shape in this one, but the idea of tight sash, you know, we can see that something is strained. We can see that something feels tight, and it's in the title as well. So perhaps constricted breathing when he was having chest and heart issues. Perhaps he was just feeling lots of pressure. These were the kinds of emotions that he painted out into these images. You can see how something like this, or the bonnet, would go nicely in, you know, on a wall in a room to accompany the furniture to complement it type thing. But it's hard for some to just, you know, read and look at it and appreciate. So this is a little bit, has a little bit more visible substance to it. So this is Oscar Kahn, and he was probably one of the most well-known of the Painters 11. So the Adoration, which is here, was first shown at the Exhibition of Contemporary Canadian Arts in 1950 and marked not for sale. It was Kahn's most ambitious work made prior to his turn to abstract painting. He wanted to keep it. It depicts the traditional baby Jesus attended by Mary, the Magi, and the animals. However, the ethnically half-Jewish Kahn's actual religious identity remains enigmatic. A friend recalled, he wished he could believe in God because he wanted so much to know the peace from believing. He made a thorough study of almost every religion in the world and had the uncomfortable habit of suddenly saying, "Tell me, why do you believe in God?" The Adoration brings Kahn's interest in the work of Georges Rouault and Gothic period German art together with Cubism. But you can kind of see it. It has the feeling, like when I look at it, I feel like it kind of feels like Picasso's Guernica, in a way that the shapes are like contorted and that they feel squished into the frame. But obviously Guernica is black and white. This has a lot more color to it, so it's easier to separate each figure. but you can also feel the large religious dialogue happening here. This is growing.
Erin,
Yes.
can I just ask, was there any reaction from, let's say, the Catholic Church or anything when he did that painting?
There's nothing in the literature that states that there was. I think that the Catholic Church kind of didn't even really pay much attention to abstraction. I mean, other than the fact that they didn't support it and that they didn't understand it and that they didn't like it. But there's nothing that I read about a specific reaction from the Catholic Church about that. You know, in theory, the Catholic Church would be happy. I mean, there's nothing grotesque about it, or there's nothing that is anti-church there. But as it said, you know, as it did say in the literature, that Caen wasn't even necessarily a Catholic. Like he did studies on all different types of religions. So oftentimes the Catholic Church were most upset about Catholics who were painting imagery against the church, you know, but he wasn't even necessarily a Catholic. So it didn't, maybe it didn't really like apply in that sense.
Okay, thank you. Just wondering.
Yeah. So this is growing form. So by 1953, Oscar was confidently painting many large abstracts in oil. He participated in 10 exhibitions that year alone and 11 more in 1954. So he has a lot of production going on. Growing form was included in his first solo show held at Hart House in Toronto in 1954 at the invitation of the art committee there. Although he was exploring purely formalist problems at the time, growing form is typical of Caen's ongoing interest in converting recognizable subject matter into emotionally resonant abstract forms. So as we can see, you know, the reason why I used the adoration was I thought it was like a good departure point, just like I've showed you in Bolzua and in Riopel, the way that like where their kind of painting practice began and then how it evolved. It's the same way that I wanted to show Caen's, so like using adoration as a departure point. And then here you can see that, you know, the images, the shapes have been posed, they've been positioned, but he's going more and more abstract and using color as a means of expressing emotion. Here's a little bit of a, I mean, it's further abstracted in some ways, but like a return to form in others. He's a very interesting artist. So this was his largest painting, entitled Warrior. And it abandons the formalist abstract works he was concurrently developing and reaches back into his earlier repertoire concerning the human condition. So that kind of echoes what I was saying. In 1952, he had shown an abstract ink drawing with gold leaf titled Two Warriors and one of their little machines. And before that, soldiers appeared in crucifixion scenes and illustrations. The old themes of suffering that he had explored in the late 1940s never left him. And in 1956, he exhibited Grief, which was another piece, a couple consoling one another, rendered in black, gray, brown, and white on board. So like this is kind of a mixture of a bunch of different paintings and painting styles that he had been experiencing. So you can see that the warrior is kind of like this large abstracted shape. You can see the most rendered, I guess, limbs or pieces in this painting are his two hands. So you can see his arm beside that really dark shape, which would probably be like his cloak. So you can see one arm coming down and then his fist sort of right in the middle of the painting. And then the other arm is towards the edge of the painting and is holding, you know, a knife or a sword. It's hard to tell, you know, any facial features, but you can tell that those black harsh brushstrokes would be chest hair, maybe moving into like a beard, and then like the yellow form up top is the warrior's head. So a really interesting way of abstraction. You know, like we kind of know that there's like the cubist way to abstract things. So you make things into like geometrical type of shapes and you mess around with their facial features and where they're located on the body. And then there's abstraction which is more expressionistic and less geometric, where forms kind of lose their shape and lose their lines and sort of melt, one color kind of melts into the other. Or you have like, you know, the Riopelle style of throwing paint, but we haven't yet seen this kind of technique where he takes the shape and contorts it, but doesn't really use any one style or you know, like box that other abstract styles have been put into. And here's the last painting that I'm showing you by him, and this one's called Small Combo. So he's most often remembered for the way that he used color. And this is kind of, I mean, you know, the red painting that we saw before, which was the growing form. There was a lot of expression through color there, but it was very red dominant. This one is blue dominant, but it has that striking red piece there too. So perhaps the combo is the red versus the blue because they're the strongest colors in the image, but this is his most abstracted, or one of his most abstracted pieces. So this is kind of where his work eventually ended up. And I know that Warrior was created after this one, but as I said, he was like experimenting with different styles of abstraction, and this is kind of where he landed. It's interesting because if you look at the painting in sections, if you look at the top right side where it has that kind of black circle, it almost looks like that could be a human head in a hood. And then the blue looks like you can almost see like shoulders and then crossed arms. And he looks like he might be sitting at a table, or like it might be a self-portrait of the artist painting, because in that little section underneath where it looks like folded arms, you can see different colors that look like they could be a palette or a painting. Does anybody else see that?
Yes, exactly.
It's I didn't see it at first when I was looking at the painting, and then all of a sudden it popped out at me.
Yeah.
That's one of the interesting parts of abstract painting is, and that's why, you know, oftentimes people don't look at paintings long enough because they don't think that there's a lot of substance in it. They just think that it's like kind of colors. Okay, fine, you know, paintings, you know, like Jack Bush's Tight Sash, they're blocks of color. Nothing's really going to pop out at you eventually, but in abstract expressionist, in expressionist abstraction, when you have kind of quote unquote scenes like this, it's worthwhile to kind of stand with it or sit with it for a while, because these kinds of things may come out eventually. Here's Tom Hodgson sketch. So Hodgson was born and raised in Toronto, went to the Central Technical School, he served during the Second World War, and then came back to study at the Ontario College of Art, where he graduated in 46. He joined the staff on an advertising agency as assistant to the art director until he entered the field of commercial art. He subsequently worked with an engraving house, and then he was a commercial artist for the Odeon theaters. So, you know, he obviously had a very creative background, well-rounded when it came to, you know, design and commercial art and advertising, and then eventually started his own art career. So this is oil on canvas board, but he has an interesting mix of colors here. The red looks quite thick, quite opaque as oil, but it makes the lighter colors around it look more translucent and look almost towards watercolors. He's quite definitely taken a scene of some sort and abstracted it. It looks perhaps like it's a room, and the lighter colors are maybe like the background, and then the stronger colors, more vibrant colors, are perhaps furniture or objects. And that's how you differentiate background from subject matter. This is probably my favorite from him. So this is non-objective greenish. You see too, when you know, you have abstract paintings, especially abstract expressionist paintings, I find that oftentimes artists don't put much time or energy into titles, because it's less about where the painting was coming from and more about where it ended up. And so where it ended up is non-objective greenish, you know? But there's not going to be some complicated or long-winded title behind it. So perhaps more than anything, it was Cahen's color juxtapositions which greatly influenced Hodgson. Solo exhibitions by Hodgson were held in 54, 56, 57, and also in 57, he received a prize in the Monsanto Canadian Art Competition. So again, this looks like it could be either a portrait. In my mind, it's a portrait that was abstracted, perhaps not a one with a head, but I feel like it could be a body, because you can kind of see the form of like a waist, and then hips, and then going down to thighs. It kind of reminds me of the torso study that we saw from Bourdieu last week, a little while back in the slideshow. And here, unlike, you know, the former image that we saw, here he stays all within cool colors. So his last one had very big color contrast between, you know, reds and blues, and then deep colors, and then more pastel colors. Here, everything feels kind of cool and flowing. And then here, this one is more more vibrant and energetic again. So this, you see, again, is just called abstract. And this is where his work eventually also ended up going, his oil on canvas or masonite. So masonite's like a board. But we can see here that it's more textural, possibly not even all applied with a paintbrush. He's gotten messier. And I don't mean messier in a bad way, but I just mean more expressive on the canvas. He seems looser. He seems more emotional in this piece. And here we have juxtaposition between between warm and cool color, but again, the red dominates and it's the most vibrant. And then the lighter colors against it look like they're less thick. Does anyone have a favorite out of the three that we saw? Because I tried to show three that were quite different in style to show how he sort of played around with different techniques and applications.
I like the greenish.
Yeah, the greenish.
And I do see the form.
Yeah.
But this one, to me, when I first saw it, I thought, oh, it's a happy pig.
Yeah, you can, I mean, it kind of looks like that like big purple circle area might be an eye. And then the other sort of turquoise light blue with like dark in the middle, you can make that out to be an eye. And then the brown sort of shape in the middle could be a mouth. I could see that. You see, that's what abstract art is interesting for, because you can pull out from it what you see or what you imagine. Here's Alexandra Luke. So she was born in Westmount, Montreal, and it wasn't until her late 20s that she began to create art. She was inspired by two local artists, Dorothy Van Leuven and Dorothy Henderson. She began to pass and organize art classes around the city. She used her wealth to help build her arts community when she moved to Oshawa and became a member of several boards and societies, including the Oshawa Women's Lyceum Club and Oshawa Historical Society. She painted landscapes in a large third floor studio in her husband's home, and soon discovered abstract art after visiting modernist exhibitions in Toronto and Ottawa. She then, pushed her practice to explore abstraction and received formal art training at the Banff School of Fine Arts in 1945, and then the Hans Hofmann School of Art in 1947. So quite well off. She was able to travel. She was able to study at well-known schools, and she began to exhibit her work in the early 50s at different venues. She organized the first Canadian abstract, she was one of the organizers of the first Canadian abstract exhibition, where she met members that would form the Painters 11, and that's how she came to start practicing with them, practicing creating. So here, her work is very abstracted. She uses, which is unlikely. I mean, it's not common for a woman to use, or it wasn't common for a woman to use this kind of color palette. Usually if a woman was painting abstract, you would see, like, she would have more kind of colors like we saw in the previous image, more lively, more vibrant, more emotional. These colors are more subdued and metallic and cold. So she was exploring with very many different things here. This one is interesting. This is called Untitled Abstraction. As I said, not the title. They didn't spend much time on naming their paintings at that era. So Alexandra Luke met Jock MacDonald in the summer of 1945 at the Banff School of Fine Arts, where MacDonald taught automatic drawing. The technique seen here in Luke's untitled composition is of that period. Her style had remained quite naturalistic until this point, and the influence of MacDonald's automatisme on her practice would be lasting. In the summers which followed, Luke attended American-German painter, as I said, Hans Hofmann School, and she further developed this technique. So you can see that there's a lot of like paint smearing going on here. And the idea of automatic painting is kind of that, your, whatever your tool is, your hand, your brush, your palette knife, whatever it is, you don't really lift it from the canvas for a certain amount of time. So it makes for these very blended kind of almost like action kind of paintings where you can see that there was lots of work being done on the canvas, like directly on the canvas, not just a lot being applied onto it, but a lot being resolved on it. And this was that same kind of style, but done more with like done with sorry? Oh, I think somebody's mic is still on. This was that same style, but rather than using oil, this was done with watercolor and with pen and ink. So you can get more of the idea of the automatic aspect here, because it's not as blended, as messy as the last image is. Because when you're using watercolor and pen and ink, you know, it doesn't see, things don't kind of melt into each other as much as if you were using oil and not removing your hand or your tool from the canvas. Here we have, so Jock MacDonald is like my favorite of the Painters 11. So he was a trailblazer in Canadian art from the 30s right through to the 60s. He was the first painter to exhibit abstract art in Vancouver, and throughout his life, he championed Canadian avant-garde artists at home and abroad. His career path reflected the times. Despite his commitment to his artistic practice, he earned his living as a teacher, becoming a mentor to several generations of artists. As a strong supporter of the artist organizations, he was a founding member of both the Canadian Group of Painters and Painters 11, and was instrumental in establishing the Calgary Group. This landscape is one of MacDonald's first attempts to express the spiritual aspect of nature in his paintings. Here he bathed in warm light the hillocks formed by the snow-laden branches, which have this kind of like biomorphic quality to them. A subtle diagonal establishes a rhythmic pulsing into the womb-like center of the composition. In color handling and mood, the painting is unique among his earlier works. So this was kind of also a departure point for MacDonald, where he was going from landscape painting towards abstraction. And I feel we can see that very clearly in this. Perhaps not at the time, but in retrospect, when we look back at his career path and his painting technique and how it evolved, this painting specifically is a clear departure point. So this is a formative color activity. So this experimental work was MacDonald's first intentionally semi-abstract painting, and it marks the beginning of his search to express the underlying principles of nature in art through the study of science, mathematics, and philosophy. So in the previous image, we can see that he's just going from nature and kind of abstracting the forms of nature. But here he starts to really like, you know, apply it kind of like as a science, like it was a real experiment. At the time, MacDonald was steeped in the multidisciplinary curriculum at the British Columbia College of Arts. Working from a still life arrangement of flowers, he created an exercise in which he would look at each patch of them and deal with them abstractly. So by magnifying a flower and painting only parts of it, he broke free from representation. And, you know, I used to, when I was in art school, do this as kind of a practice, and I can't remember sort of who brought it to my attention, whether it was like another student or whether it was a teacher. But, you know, if you're painting, like if you paint landscapes or you paint portraits or you paint still lifes or whatever, and you don't know how to depart from that to the abstract. Well, the idea is that you take a painting that you've already done and you square off a little section and like magnify it and then just paint that, and you end up with like, you know, and like abstract forms or a different, or like some colors juxtaposed next to each other on the canvas. And so it's not like you're just going from nothing and creating an abstract painting. You're taking a piece of it already, like a figurative painting or a rendered painting, and quote unquote abstracting it by honing in or magnifying in on one little section. And this is essentially what McDonald started doing. So you can see that this is like a very close-up image of an abstracted flower. And he's treated each section separately, which is why there's so many colors, you know? And it's interesting because the top left-hand side of it actually looks like the sky. So maybe that portion of the flower he felt, you know, looked kind of like a sunset or whatever, but it looks like the sky and clouds in the sky. And I find that parts of it look like they could be bird feathers. And then he's kept like the stalk of the flower and the leaves on the bottom left, quite realistic. Really interesting piece. I love this painting. And look, like that's in 1934. That's quite early for something like that. Here I want to get your opinions on this painting. So let me explain it first. So this is Departing Day. So this painting of an abstracted evening sky is one of McDonald's first modalities or thought forms in nature. Although he retrospectively dated it 1935, it was most certainly painted in October 1936 at the end of his nearly 18 months in Nootka Sound. In his notes, McDonald recorded discoveries about the solar system, outlining the physical properties of the planets, their distance from one another, and tracing space to the utmost limit of human conception. So reaching beyond representation in this work, he sought to portray the concept of the cosmic. The image, influenced by contemporary scientific photography, is flat and geometric. Volume is obliterated. The composition relies on simply evoked forms of nature and the tension created by the juxtaposition of the elements. Does anybody else see what looks like an eyeball? Because before I read anything about this painting, I looked at this and I was like, the top left, you know, which in theory would be the sun, looks like an eye, like, and the center, like the pupil, and then, you know, the iris that kind of has like that formation around it, and then the exterior of the eye. And then the bottom right, like that doesn't look like crevices in a planet to me. It looks like veins in an eyeball, and the white circle behind the black looks to me like, you know, you're inside the head, you're inside the eye socket, and on the other side of that white circle would be outside of the eye. Am I crazy, or does anybody else kind of see that?
My first reaction was that was an eyeball.
Okay, good.
The same way as you see,
Well,
like with the veins and everything.
Yeah.
definitely
Okay.
with the veins. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good. Because I was like, what? How does nobody, like, I didn't understand how, because, so that write-up was from the Art Institute of Canada. Somebody had, like, on the website of the Art Institute of Canada, they have it really interesting, there's like online books, there's online articles written by art historians on various different Canadian artists. And so there was a write-up about this painting, and I kept like reading through the write-up going, okay, but where's the mention of the eyeball? Like, how does the art historian not see this and consider it at all? But there was no mention. And I found that nuts.
Until you found out that he was studying the cosmos, that he was trying, you know.
Yeah, and I mean, for sure I see it, but you know, but then again, they also I mean, philosophy also says that, everything is a reflection of the universe. So, the eyeball is a reflection of the universe and of the cosmos. So maybe that sort of speaks to that whole dialogue,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, this is the last one that I'm showing from him. And this goes back to like the flower painting, because we see that it's kind of like within that style. But now it feels like he's gone much more spiritual, right? So interesting title. Russian Fantasy is typical of the fully realized automatic watercolor paintings that McDonald created between 1945 and 1952, although this one is quite a bit earlier. This work reflects the impact of the automatic painting style that McDonald learned from the British surrealist artist and psychiatrist Grace Palethorpe. Through a painstaking process and closely guided by his mentors, McDonald learned how to free his mind as he created drawings and paintings. Once the automatic drawing was completed, meaning nonstop drawing, as I mentioned before, his mentors encouraged him to find and extrapolate imagery that lay hidden in the drawings. So again, the idea of, and we talked about this with Baudrillard and with Rio Pel, and this was one of the sort of mantras of the automatist group, is that you sort of try and clear your mind of any preconception, and you just draw or you just paint. And then once you're finished, whatever time frame you gave yourself, well, then you look at what landed on the painting, on the canvas or on the paper, and then you pull the imagery out of it. So this was an exercise in that. So through the application of overlapping wet washes and by grading deep purple through Prussian blue, McDonald achieved an exquisite richness. The brilliance of his color creates a work in which the painted surface almost breathes. You can see different levels of it. If you slowly turn the painting a full 360 degrees as he slowly turned the painting a full 360 degrees as he painted, to sort of add to the whole process of not trying to have any preconceptions of what was going to turn around. So by forcing yourself to change the angle at which you're painting, you're not following any kind of idea of up or down or left or right, because your angle keeps changing. That's what the literature means when it says that it was painstaking, because it's like nothing's comfortable. You can't fall into a comfort zone when you're creating a piece like that, because you're constantly challenging yourself by, either closing your eyes or changing the angle or not looking at what you're doing, or anytime you start to go too far down one vein of thought, you sort of force yourself to change it. So it's a very challenging way of creating. I'm sorry, this was Russian Fantasy. The other one was another version of Modalities. But again, this is another automatic form. It's really interesting to look close up at one of these automatic drawings to try and see where one line continues into another and the shapes that they create. And now we're going towards contemporary art in Canada. So this is perfect. We have 1 hour left. So we can kind of take our time through this. So up until now, we've seen kind of all different styles of art that evolved in Canada, that were, that were either created in Europe or that were created here in Canada, and then that were used as influences from one generation to the next. Like when we think about the way that the painters of great romantic landscapes then informed and influenced the Group of Seven, who then informed and influenced the Beaver Hall group, who then informed and influenced abstract. And basically, when you think about art history and anything in history, there's the saying, history repeats itself, and that's very true. And when you think about that and apply it to art history, you think about the fact that artists will always look towards older artists. Like, even if you're revolutionary in your time, if you love art, well, you inherently and without a doubt also don't just love the art that you're starting to create from this point forward, but you look to the history of art, to certain artists that, speak to you, or that you can appreciate their technique, or you look at how certain techniques developed. And that's what gets us to here and today. So the artists that we're going to look at moving forward, we're going to start with Mary Pratt and Alex Colville, because they're they're contemporary, but they're older contemporary. But then the three artists that we're going to end with are artists that are doing like kind of remixes of older techniques and bringing them to new heights to move forward with. So we're going to start with Mary Pratt. So Mary Pratt is an essential and beloved figure in Canadian art. Her paintings invest mostly domestic subjects with near photographic detail and compelling, often dark complexity. A professional artist for over 50 years, Pratt was born in New Brunswick, but was based in Newfoundland for most of her career. Pratt's work first came to national prominence in the 1970s after years of isolation and struggle and painting. She eventually became an iconic Canadian artist in her own right, despite the public's tendency to compare her with her work of her former husband, Christopher Pratt. When Pratt died in St. John's in 2018, friend and former Governor General of Canada, Adrienne Clarkson, called her our greatest female painter since Emily Carr. Pratt's subject was the immediate world around her, most often the objects and people within her homes in Newfoundland and in Nova Scotia. Here's a first piece from her. So this is Eviscerated Chickens. So over the course of the 1970s, Pratt's choice of subject matter began to expand, with less attractive subjects such as raw meat, fish heads, and eggshells playing an important role. She had chosen to focus on the domestic, and that meant that not all of her subjects were going to be pretty, but they all, at least to her, were beautiful. And in her paintings, she teased out the qualities that had attracted her in the first place. In every instance, she sought that evocative, arresting moment of objects bathing in light. She remembered Eviscerated Chickens as being somewhat controversial. It was the first time I painted something that a lot of people didn't like. Notably, it took Pratt months to finish this work, which was left unfinished while she contemplated whether to continue to pursue a painting career. Imagine. As a child in Fredericton, Pratt had often visited the market with her mother and grandmother, and the sight of either plucked or eviscerated chickens was not uncommon. I have never been able to entirely forget the barbarism of butchering, she wrote. The Sunday chickens, naked, empty, waiting on a Coca-Cola carton to be roasted, symbolized much about life in this civilization. The chickens are seen from above against the shadowy background of a wall. Stark and unapologetic, the work reflects the visceral quality of much domestic labor. Yet Pratt sees and conveys beauty in her handling of light, texture, and color. In numerous interviews over the years, she maintained that her work has a hidden edge, a thorn awaiting the unwary viewer. There can be beauty in ugliness too, these works assert, and surprise for the viewer in realizing it. Eviscerated Chickens is the earliest work of hers where the edginess is central. So if you've ever seen, if you're familiar with Mary Pratt's work at all, she, more than anything, I mean, her rendering of, you know, realism is unparalleled in my opinion with any of her colleagues at the time. But what makes her work stand out, what makes it so incredibly special, is her handling of light. Light is central in every single piece that she has ever created. I'm confident in saying that. Like, it looks like a photograph. So this is Salmon on Saran. So Salmon on Saran is one of Pratt's best known images, and it has the fully developed painterly virtuosity that became a hallmark of her work. Pratt's tour de force here is conveying the transparency of the Saran wrap through paint, an example of the artist pushing her technical abilities to their absolute limits. The painting took Pratt 2 years to complete. It's a bold statement about her technical abilities, a show of painterly bravado, reminiscent of male artists in the Western tradition from the ancient Greek painting contests recounted by Pliny the Elder to the 19th century Paris salons. Pratt effectively managed to paint the unpaintable, making an opaque substance, oil paint, transparent, cellophane. Incredible, incredible technique. She said that she had to discover a shorthand for plastic wrap, and she had to come to terms with how much reality really interested her. She said it's very easy to now discuss, but very perplexing then to solve it. Even the fish scales, you know, like and it's reminiscent of the sort of goosebumps, if you will, on the chicken skin, is similar to how much detail there is in the fish scales here. And even the fact that, like, where the fish scales are darker, like, you can tell that that's where the fish was handled, where it was held. And so they're damaged now. And that little bit of fish blood just above. Amazing. Oh, there's a question or comment. Unbelievable. I don't like either painting, but yeah, it is like a photograph. You don't always have to like the painting, but it's, in this case, it's more about respecting or just acknowledging the craftsmanship, the technique.
Her use of light, she's just, it's remarkable.
It's remarkable. Yeah, it really is. So in this painting, Pratt's first grandchild is Pratt's first grandchild, her elder daughter Anne's first child. The two adults on the periphery are Mary herself and her daughter Anne. In interviews over the years, Pratt repeatedly called this work a favorite, telling House and Home, for example, that the one I love the most is the baby in the bath. The work is in a tradition of portraits of babies and children. One thinks of the Child's Bath, 1893, from Marie Cassatt, for instance, or Children at the Basin by Berthe Morisot. Both Marie Cassatt and Berthe Morisot, two very prominent Impressionist painters from France. In comparison to its Impressionist forerunners, however, the impact of this painting is much less decorous than we might expect. The baby's genitals are clearly visible, a view that many would find uncomfortable despite its innocence. This work depicts an intimate family moment as 3 generations of females interact, a private moment made public in the painting. It is both heavily symbolic and very ordinary, familiar and marvelous at once, as are so many of Pratt's paintings. Yet there is a thorn in this family's scene, a sharp prick of discomfort. The vivid, bloody red of both baby and bathwater seems to connote infant sacrifice, and it can be no accident that this child is female. Wonder and dread attend her ritual rebirth, wrote Robin Lawrence about this work. Just as the family's Sunday dinner could be painted by Pratt as if she was depicting a sacrifice, this deceptive painting can easily lead the viewer, as it did to Lawrence, down a darker path than is immediately apparent in the composition. Pratt was never surprised by these sorts of readings. People will find out that in one of the paintings, there is something that ought to disturb them, something upsetting, she said. That's why I painted them. So, you know, in one sense, or on the one hand, you can look at this as like a beautiful moment between mother and grandmother and child. And then you can also look for the darker kind of connotations that can be attached to it. When I look at a painting like this, you know, my mind goes back to Paul Peel with the imagery of, you know, where he painted the two little children sitting after the bath by the fire, and the fact that that was met by critics as being sort of perverted or grotesque. And one wonders whether it has to do with the fact that it was a man painting nude children versus a woman painting nude children, that, you know, as much as this is like, it talks about as much as it talks about sacrifice and like the fact that there's blood in the water and that the genitals are visible, it doesn't talk about perversion. And you wonder, like, is it not talking about perversion because it's a baby and it's not a child, like it's not old enough to have perversion attached to it? Or is it because it's a woman versus a man and perversion isn't attached to women as much as it's attached to men? Like it's interesting to compare those two kind of scenarios and those two paintings, and to question, you know, what the viewer and what the art historians are able to pull out from paintings based on preconceptions of female versus male artists. Here's one that kind of, I mean, it's typical of her in the sense that it's all about the capturing of the light, but it strays from her regular renditions of all things in the home, because this is outside of the home. So this is Burning of the Rhododendron. So at well over 2 meters wide, Burning of the Rhododendron is one of Pratt's largest works. This scale was possible only because of a change in working methods, switching from oil on panel or canvas to mixed media, which is watercolor and chalk, or oil pastels on paper. It was made a year after she showed a series of these fire drawings at Mira Goodall Gallery in Toronto, an exhibition called Flames. Light had always been Pratt's chief subject, captured as it played across the surfaces of things, transforming the mundane into the sensual and erotic. We see that the ephemeral play of light from a past painting entitled The Bed, or On the Scales of the Fish and Salmon on Saran. Her series of fireworks, however, is not much about how light transforms objects, but about how light itself is a beautiful destroyer. Pratt told critics Tom Smart, that the fire had to be alive. So writing about an earlier work from this series, she said, the careless slap and dash of mixing a water-based medium with a waxy medium allowed me to make this bonfire work. And the rendering is, again, quite remarkable. When she said that the fire had to be alive, she's speaking to her obsession with rendering reality. So it wasn't just that you could tell, she didn't just want you to be able to tell that it was a fire. The fire had to seem alive in the painting. And look at all of the little scratch marks. I mean, not just the scratch marks in the actual fire, but then the little scratch marks that are at the base of the painting. And then also the little kind of like scratch marks, that the little flicks of blue that are just outside of the orange of the fire, that are like reflecting off the water, because it looks to be that there's water and kind of like a beach or a sand dune or something behind it. And then here, this was the most recent work that I found from hers. And this was from 2005. So she died in 2015 or 2013. So this was one of her last pieces. Sorry, she died in 2018. So of all the fruit Pratt chose as subjects over the years, which were bananas, cherries, oranges, grapes, apples, she most consistently returned to pomegranates. The pulpy fruit with its vibrant red seeds has a charged sexual connotation, notable throughout art and culture, and proved irresistible to her. If you remember back to, if you watched my lectures on still life from our last course, when I talked about still life painting in general, pomegranates were always seen as very sensual, sexualized fruits. So so this work from 2005 makes the illusion extreme of the fact that it's one of her most realistic images of fruit that she ever created. The pomegranate pulp and seeds read almost as flesh, reminiscent of a painting of a raw piece of meat. Over the last productive decade of work Pratt often revisited previous themes and tended to focus on still lifes such as this one. The treatment of the pomegranates is more dramatic than much of her earlier work, with the pomegranate juice splattering the tinfoil. It is a technically challenging piece with its multiple reflections and translucent juice, and conveys Pratt's distinctive interest in contained violence. In writing of another pomegranate painting of Pratt's, Robin Lawrence points out that the pomegranate seed has long been a symbol of fertility along a continuum of passion, conception, nurturance, and death. And so that's the same critic who talked about the baby painting. And in this painting, she says that it has a powerful erotic charge. Quite amazing how much of this painting is the color red, and yet still how diverse and complex it is. Now we move on to Alex Colville. So his career spanned over 70 years and comprised hundreds of works painted between his two homes in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. So like Pratt, Pratt had a home in Newfoundland, but she also had a home in Nova Scotia. Colville was in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. Consistent in his dedication to figuration and allegorical compositions, Colville kept returning to the same major themes: family life, desire, individual will, and relationships between men and women, humans and animals, nature and the machine, and above all, order and chaos. And he died in 2013. So we see some similarities in like the sort of subject matter and kind of like feeling between Colville and Pratt, although their work visually, aesthetically was quite different. So here we have To Prince Edward Island, which is one of his best known pieces. So Colville's most iconic imagery has the power to seem ubiquitous. This painting has become almost as familiar as an image to Canadians as his horse and train, yet it has none of the overt drama or dreamlike qualities of the earlier work. The scene of To Prince Edward Island is situated on the top deck of a PEI ferry, where a woman looks directly out at the viewer through a pair of binoculars while a man sits behind her, his face obscured by her body. Colville situated this painting as a contrast between what he describes as the searching vision of the female and the stupid and passive approach of the male gaze. The woman sees and the man does not. As can be seen in a work from 2001 called Surveyor, which we will see in just a moment, the act of perceiving is a constant theme in Colville's work. In To Prince Edward Island, that theme is joined with another of his common themes, the relationships between men and women, particularly husband and wife. To PEI encapsulates much of what makes Colville's work both idiosyncratic and universal. His pictures are not sequential narratives, though they often feel as if they are segments in a story, nor are they reasoned arguments, really. They are deeply conceptual, ideas made whole as self-contained images. And that's interesting that that is said that Colville's images don't necessarily all follow one theme, but they all seem like segments in a story. And I feel like that is in part because they have kind of like a caricature quality to them. They almost feel like stills from like a comic strip in some ways by the way that they're created, by the way that they're painted. So this one is Black Cat, and this is a serigraph on paper, so it's like a print. So a process in which he was self-taught and which he did on his own, never working with printers. Serigraphs are an important part of Colville's practice. And I showed this because I feel like a lot of people aren't really aware of his serigraphs. Prints were a way of reaching a larger audience and presented a set of physical and intellectual challenges that were often, that were different from painting and demanding in their own way. So the idea of a serigraph, which is basically like another way of saying like a silkscreen print. So you push ink towards a very fine mesh onto paper, but you only, like it's done by a series of different prints. So like you have to go over the image every time with a different color to eventually build the image. So you can see that there are a bunch of different colors here, but like it looks like everything is kind of scratched on, and that's because of the printing process. I chose this image not only because I wanted to show examples of his print work, but also because it is an interesting layout, just like the trip to PEI, where you see the woman in front of the man. The man is like hidden in a sense. And here it's the same thing. So like the cat is in the forefront, in the foreground, and the man is kind of hidden. And a lot of art historians and critics say that basically all of Colville's paintings that had a man present in them are self-portraits, but it's self-portraits with him hidden in some way, in some way, you know, that makes him not fully visible. So it's kind of a way of protecting himself, of not being so exposed and not being so vulnerable. And then one of his later works is this. So this is Studio. So Colville's most stark and uncompromising self-portrait. Studio presents the artist in full length, standing naked before the viewer, his hand clasped over his genitals. He exposes himself to our scrutiny, but really it is he who is the observer. Painted from an image in a full-length mirror, this work is an unstinting self-examination by the artist who takes observation to great lengths. He created numerous self-portraits, but the Studio is the only one presented without props, such as a pistol, a ruler, or an animal, something to divert the attention, something to divert the gaze. Here, he is really just putting himself out there. And not only is he not interrupted by anything else around him, but he's naked. And not only is he naked, but he's not making it, you know, attractive in any way. I mean, he's standing there full frontal with just his hands covering himself. And even to the point where you can see the roll of toilet paper there. Like, there's nothing that gets less glamorous than this self-portrait. And it's just so interesting that after all the years of trying to, you know, hide himself in certain ways, whether it be with props in front of him, or like I said, with things just diverting the viewer's attention. It's almost like when he got older, when he reached this age, he was finally like ready with this piece to like put it all out there. This is the painting that I mentioned before called Surveyor. So again, it works with the gaze. This is, you know, classic of his style in the sense that it's his same technique of painting. And it's realistic, but it still has that sort of feeling of like caricature, like that feeling of like a layer of something in between reality and the viewer, which is classic to why it makes it feel like everything is like a still in a story. What's also interesting here is juxtaposition between like nature and human intervention, like the fact that the surveyor, you know, is dressed with like the hard hat and the orange, like it's all very construction type thing, you know, but looking out, it's all very human constructed, but looking out on this like vast landscape. And here's one of his latest works, like one of his final works that he did. So this one is Artist and Car. So here again, you know, it's a self-portrait, and fine, he's not standing behind anything, but the car is bigger than him, the car is brighter than him, he's rendered it more realistically than he even rendered himself. There's no facial features that can be seen properly. You can kind of see like the outline of his mouth, but you know, the hat obviously shades, like puts a shadow on his eyes, so you can't really see his face very much. So like I said, in every other portrait except for the one in the studio, he seems to like divert attention from him in some way. So now we're going on to Gathy Falk. So Gathy Falk is one of Canada's most acclaimed living artists. She imbues ordinary objects and everyday rituals with qualities of the sublime. From humble beginnings in Manitoba, she has become a leading figure in Vancouver's artistic community and received international recognition for her painting and ceramic sculpture, as well as her pioneering work in installation and performance. Now in her 90s, Falk continues to produce and exhibit regularly, enjoying critical and popular success for work that has never veered from her playful, purposeful, and unapologetically personal vision. So she's been active since the 60s. So this is called Home Environment, and it's a room-sized installation that combines found objects with Falk's ceramic renderings of domestic items. Thrift store armchairs are flocked and painted pale pink. One has a ceramic men's jacket and tie strewn on the back, and a large ceramic fish resting on each arm. Other pieces of found furniture, a sideboard, dresser, piano stool, occasional table, are painted gray and flocked or lacquered in red. You also see that there's like a bird cage, but there's like a little radio and some sculpture in cases, and then pictures on the wall. So the idea with Falk's installation work here is like, this is the first, you know, and she's doing this kind of installation work in the late 60s. And this is kind of work that is very contemporary that you would see even still today, but she was doing it back before it was mainstream. So she was a pioneer in sort of installation art. And the fact, like her aesthetic strength, aside from installation, is her ceramic, and the fact that she's able to take a material as hard as ceramic and make it look like dainty and playful and fragile and realistic. So this is 196 apples, and these fruits are in the fruits are in Gathy Falk's ceramic. 196 apples are stacked in a pyramid, much like one would see at a fruit stand. She describes them as part organic form, part geometric structure. Each of the apples was first thrown on the wheel and then shaped by hand and glazed individually. All were stacked and fired together so that the pile would be bonded by the glaze. The methodological arrangement of the individual apples, which are consistent in size, is offset by the fact that each piece of fruit is in part handmade and is further made distinctive in the coloration of its glaze. So she worked a lot in this style. So her fruit series, and particularly piles of apples, constitutes perhaps the fundamental Falk image. She began working on the series in the late 60s, making it of the same vintage as Home Environment. While repetition and the serial form are recurring devices in Falk's practice, the fruit piles in their orderly, systematic arrangements are somewhat unique. Over the course of the 3 years that Falk worked on this series, she created dozens of piles of ceramic apples, oranges, and grapefruits. And this that you're looking at now is the largest and most iconic of that series. And it reveals a very particular way in which Falk used the language of ceramic sculpture and what was important to her. So she was like a real ceramicist, but a sculpture artist at the same time. So this goes further into her installation work. This is My Dog's Bones. So it includes 690 real bones collected by Gathy Falk and her friends and laboriously cleaned by the artist, suspended from a ceiling grid using butcher's twine. They hover above 16 small spruce trees in pots arranged in a square on the floor, a recurring visual element that had previously appeared in works such as A Bird is Known by His Feathers Alone and Theater in Black and White, so other works by her. When the work was installed, Falk painted shadows of the bones on the walls and the trees on the floor, such that they intermingled with the actual shadows cast by the work. The installation was created in response to an invitation to be in Aurora Borealis, a groundbreaking group exhibition organized by the Montreal International Centre of Contemporary Art in 1985, which brought together 30 Canadian artists to create installations in approximately 4,000 square meters of unused basement retail space in Place du Parc in Montreal. So again, like originally this was done in 1985. It was an installation afterwards in a different gallery, but it speaks to her original installation works from the late 1960s and how they've evolved. And the idea with installation work is how the viewer interacts with the installation. You know, and in the 1960s, it was kind of in a box. So you weren't really walking into the room, but you were looking at the room from just outside of it. Whereas this sculpture in 85, this installation, and like sculpture, conceptual sculpture and installation are kind of like synonymous, you know? So when I say sculpture, I mean installation and vice versa, because it is both a sculpture and an installation. But this one is more interactive in the sense that the viewer who is in the gallery space is meant to walk in between the sculpture itself and the shadows that are painted onto the wall. And it creates an interesting kind of scenario, because you see people go into these kinds of gallery spaces and they don't know whether they should walk through or not. And a lot of people will walk around rather than walking in between. And that creates, so it's the idea of like how the viewer is or isn't interacting with the conceptual piece. And that is basically the intention of the artist, to see how people interact with their work. That's what installation art is. Here is dresses with insect box, and also dressed with insect box and also dressed with candles. So two works of hers that were ceramic dresses that she created. So the form has been built up in the medium so that the dress appears as though there is a body present. The absent body is an unidealized one, and the dress is a little old-fashioned with its high rounded collar and elbow-length puffed sleeves. Falk has used her considerable abilities as a painter on the surface of the dress. There are subtle variations in the coloration, as if she were rendering the three-dimensional object in the 2 dimensions of paint on canvas. And keep in mind, when she does her work, even when it's large scale work, she doesn't use like a maquette or like a frame underneath. So she's really creating it just by hand and just by form. And that technically is very hard. Okay, now we get to real contemporary stuff. So these last 3 artists that I'm going to be showing you are artists. They're all Indigenous, and they are cutting edge Canadian artists who are trying to bridge the gap between Canadian history and the reconciliation of Canadian art history. And we'll see that in their work as we finish our series. So, Kent Monkman is known for his provocative interventions into Western European and American art history. He's a Cree artist, and he grew up in Winnipeg, passionate about art and profoundly aware of how colonialism had affected Indigenous communities. Drawing on early expressions in illustration and theater, he has worked in painting, photography, installation, film, and performance. Through his gender fluid alter ego, Mischief Eagle Testicle, so mischief also plays into the idea of mischief. And when we say alter ego, gender fluid, so he is a man, but in his performances, he dresses as a female chief named Mischief Eagle Testicle, a shape-shifting supernatural being Monkman created opportunities to confront colonial injustice, challenge received notions of history, advocate for social change, and honor the resistance and resilience of Indigenous peoples, and also queer Indigenous peoples and queer people in general. His major exhibitions in Canada and the United States have been unprecedented interventions of decolonization. By exposing the complexities of historic and contemporary Indigenous experiences, Kent Monkman has raised awareness of critical challenges facing communities today. He has brought together explorations of two-spirit identity and sexuality with a commitment to investigating treaties and recognizing lived realities for Indigenous people in cities and on reserves. And he has developed groundbreaking projects to decolonize museums across Turtle Island. Through deeply personal and compelling work, he has provoked transformative conversations about identity and history in Canada. So this piece is entitled The Impending Storm, where Monkman tells of a mythological tragic romance between Miss Chief Eagle Testicle and her Orangeman lover, the young Thomas Scott. We see two figures, Miss Chief and Scott, fleeing together from a dark, ominous cloud hovering over a landscape inspired by the monumental works of Canadian romantic landscape artists. The painting is part of a series that Monkman refers to interchangeably as the moral landscape, or Eros and Empire, and is the first of a three-part narrative titled The Trilogy of St. Thomas. The Impending Storm offers a fictional narrative about the story of Scott, who was an Irish Protestant who moved to the Red River Colony, which is now part of Manitoba, in 1869. The following year, Scott was convicted on treason and executed by the provisional government led by Métis leader Louis Riel on March 4th. The event led to the Red River expedition, in which Prime Minister Johnny MacDonald sent a military force to the colony to confront the Métis at Red River. The storm is used as an allegory for an ending of innocence and the suggestion of impending doom, as if representing the threats that were about to encroach on Indigenous existence following the events at Red River. Rather than portraying conflict or rivalry, Monkman, and this is important, Monkman decided to use the paintings as a vehicle for reconciliation through a love story. The tale is conceived as a metaphor for the entwined histories and relationships between white settlers and Indigenous peoples. By adapting the conventions of 19th century artworks and by fusing fact and fiction, Monkman projects his own stories upon landscapes that are sites of contact and contention. The fact that it is depicted as that they are depicted as in romantic paintings are evidence to the environment's power over humans and a metaphor of the threat that the untamed wilderness faces from human activity. So this is what I mean when it's a remix of past subject matter. So it's like he's obviously an incredibly talented artist, an incredibly talented painter. So he takes the idea of romantic landscape, where the landscape is like the main character and humans are depicted as tiny in comparison to the landscape. So what you see right away, you look at the landscape right away, and then you see the humans, and then you see that they're two men, and then you see that they're not fully clothed, and then you come to realize that they're gay. And then you see that one of them is an Indigenous person and one of them is a white man, and you consider, and then all of a sudden it becomes a completely different story. And then you want to know what is going on in this painting. And so Monkman does that on purpose to create curiosity and to create dialogue. But it's like, you can't, first and foremost, you look at the painting for its incredible aesthetic quality, and then its shock value hits you, which is genius. Similarly, we have The Triumph of Miss Chief. So this is a seminal work that provides a multi-layered critique of colonization. Monkman's alter ego, Mischief, wears only a pair of pumps and a pink shawl draped and fluttering over her arm as she strolls through a wild and detailed scene of homoerotic imagery, violence, and debauchery. Indigenous peoples, trappers, and explorers circle around her. Also making appearances are the late 18th century explorers Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, depicted at the far left of the painting, grappling with a bear, with Sacagawea just beyond them. Artist Pablo Picasso, seen just to the right of Mischief, wearing a striped shirt and surrounded by Black men in poses reminiscent of his Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. George Catlin and Paul Kane. Paul Kane, remember, he was the one that we looked at that did representations of indigenous peoples, but romanticized and not realistic and not accurate. And figures from indigenous culture and prophecy, including the white buffalo, the shapeshifter who gave the gift of 7 sacred ceremonies to the Lakota people. And in the foreground meadow, a variety of transgressions take place that are cultural, sexual, and social in nature. Created in response to Catlin's dance to the Burdish, which Monkman viewed at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington in 2004, the work also nods to the triumph of Christianity over paganism, a masterpiece by Gustave Doré, in its playful, sexually charged reversal, where Mischief takes the central position of Christ and pokes at iconic 19th century paintings of the Western frontier. The use of sexuality in Monkman's works is a deliberate deconstruction of the logics of power and draws viewers into a scene that counters preconceived notions of historical and contemporary settler indigenous relations. So you see how I'm saying here that they're taking old notions, old depictions, old renditions, and remixing them and making them recognizable, but not how or where they should be. So it makes you question everything. And that's what I mean by artists like Kent Monkman, who are clearly influenced by the past and take examples from the past and then sort of redeliver them in a different way. So this one's called Miss America. And it is the first work in the 4 Continents series that Monkman produced between 2012 and 2016, which was shown in its entirety at the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery the year it was completed. So he did one, this is Miss America, he did a Miss Europe, he did a Miss Asia, and he did a Miss Africa. So in a triangular composition, Mischief is seen riding an alligator, raising a feather to the sky and holding court over a diverse tangle of figures that include a basketball player, a British soldier, a mermaid that looks like Marilyn Monroe, indigenous people of ambiguous gender identities, Aztecs and Mayans. The 4 Continents is a reinterpretation of the Rococo ceiling fresco Apollo and the 4 Continents by Giovanni Battista Tiepolo, which Monkman had seen in books in the early 2000s and in person at the Würzburg residence in Germany, the former home of the Prince Bishops in 2013 and 2014. And if you remember, if you were part of our course that looked at Renaissance, Baroque, and Rococo, I showed the Würzburg residence in Germany, and I showed the Apollo and the 4 Continents by Tiepolo. So if you remember that, then you'll kind of be able to situate where this, like how this image is constructed and where it's coming from. So Miss America incorporates a mashup of symbolism. A Catholic priest accepts the one-armed embrace of a Mohawk warrior, a canoe features a Mercedes-Benz logo, and a man wears a wolfskin hood and carries a pale lavender parasol. There is also a homoerotic image of Saint Sebastian in jeans, cowboy boots, and a belt with a Chanel logo. The inclusion of emblems of modernity, like the logos, alludes to the multiple ways in which trade and theft are manifested in global narratives. I wanted to think about a contemporary version of globalism and how consumer culture and corporate culture have impacted Indigenous people on the various continents. So again, a lot of contemporary art is all about narrative. It's all about making people ask questions, and it's all about people, it's educational. You know, they're like history pieces, but reimagined. This is Le Petit Déjeuner sur l'herbe. So right away, when you think Le Petit Déjeuner sur l'herbe, that is the title of a painting from Edouard Manet, which was right at the beginning of the Impressionist era. So Petit Déjeuner sur l'herbe is part of the Urban Res series that Monkman produced between 2013 and 2016, which focuses on Winnipeg's North End community, home to many Indigenous peoples. The setting is the compressed, confined space of the city. There is little landscape except for what is seen through a chain link fence. The naked figures of women lying in the street are made of multiple flattened planes, sharp angular shapes, and chopped, distorted forms appropriated from Cubism and the radical reinventions of female nudes by Pablo Picasso. They are a parody of that artist's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, a famous group portrait, obviously, that we know of prostitutes in Barcelona. An expensive car is parked outside, implying that the owner is upstairs with one of the women. The abuse and violence implicit in the scene are underscored by a figure modeled on Picasso's air raid mural Guernica in 1937. Monkman has described the series as depicting a hostile environment of the predator and prey, in particular, the reality that Indigenous women are preyed upon. The title of this painting references the painting by Edouard Manet, as I said, which is considered groundbreaking in its time as a key example of modernism. In that work, a nude woman gazes directly at the viewer as she sits with two clothed men in the grass in a park. Manet's representation of the women countered the demure, idealized nude of the academic tradition. And in collapsing pictorial space, he favored a flattened modernist approach. Commenting on the composition, Monkman noted that Manet transformed conventions of particular pictorial space and set modernism on its path. So Monkman's appropriations represent the colonialist and modernist violence inflicted on the female form and spirit. Referring to Picasso's butchering of the female nude, Monkman's work refutes European ideas and the impact of modernism that Indigenous cultures have faced, as well as the dehumanization endured by Indigenous women in particular. He sees the whole modernist period in European art in parallel with the effects on Indigenous communities wrought by other symptoms of modernity, including the railways and the Indian Act. Picasso also acts as a foil for Monkman's own sensibility and sexuality. The angels seem to be mysterious and ambiguous, but they're cherubs, often seen in Baroque paintings, Renaissance ceilings, and sacred European frescoes. Yet the angels in this work resemble women. They may signify grace, but also the destructive impact of Christianity on First Nations communities. And it questions whether they are preying on the souls or saving them. So here we have the Daddies, which is an appropriation of a meeting of the delegates of British North America to settle the terms of Confederation in Quebec, which is the conference where political leaders discussed plans for the formation of the Dominion of Canada. The painting is often referred to as the Fathers of Confederation, which I think is like the more recognizable term or title. In Monkman's work, Miss Chief perches on an ottoman covered in a Hudson's Bay blanket, a salute to the Indigenous hunters and trappers who worked for the company. She is nude save for her signature black Louboutin heels. She has invited herself to this gathering of white men who are deciding her people's fate, and she gestures to the fathers, asking them to consider Indigenous title to territory. Ms. Chief subverts both official portraiture conventions and Canadian political history by imposing an Indigenous queer presence on the origins of Confederation. This work was created just before a critical national moment. In 2017, Indigenous rights activists occupied the grounds of Parliament Hill 4 days before Canada Day celebrations, marking the 150th anniversary of Confederation, in protest of the concept of commemorating a history that ignores the tumultuous relationship between Indigenous peoples and the rest of Canada. Resistance 150 was a way to inspire other Indigenous people to reclaim what they lost during the colonization. In this painting, Ms. Chief, by being present, establishes a reoccupation as well. With a gesture of her arm, she raises attention to the confiscation of Indigenous lands brought on by the government, highlighting a serious issue concurrent with the National Day, with Unsettling Canada at 150 and the National Day of Action, which is coming up in 2 days. So very appropriate that we're looking at this painting just 2 days away from Canada Day. So you can see the real fathers of Confederation, which is on the bottom. Monkman has rendered it, impeccably. But what's interesting is that he's changed. I mean, obviously he's added in Miss Chief with the Hudson's Bay blanket and such, but it's the looks on the faces of the people in the image. And also in the back right corner, there is a discretion screen in the original, and he's taken that away, which is also very, is also a metaphor for not hiding anything anymore.
What was the, sorry, Erin, what was the discretion screen? I don't understand what it
I mean, I don't necessarily think that it had any purpose or any meaning in the original painting. Like, it was just painted in. You see on the bottom and on the right, like that there was like a discretion screen, like a separating a screen. But the fact that Monkman took it out, it speaks to the fact of not hiding anything anymore.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. So this is the scream. I mean, the painting speaks for itself. It derives its title from The Scream by Edward Munch, and references the horrors of the residential school system in the late 19th century, when the Canadian government imposed aggressive assimilation on Indigenous peoples. More than 150,000 Indigenous children were forced to attend residential schools between the late 1800s and the 1990s. 1990s. Imagine how recent that is. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children were taken from their parents and placed in institutions whose objective was to strip them of their language, culture, and identity. Many children suffered physical, psychological, and sexual abuse, and several thousand died. Monkman's The Scream viscerally and unflinchingly captures the violence of these facilities, depicting children being ripped from the arms of their mothers and by members of the Catholic clergy and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. At the center is a mother who lunges forward with her arms outstretched toward her child who has been pulled away from her by a priest. The work testifies to the Canadian government's systematic effort to exterminate Indigenous people, their languages, and their cultures. And the scream is the woman's scream who is reaching towards her child. Whereas we've seen from Monkman's work that he tries to, in certain instances, recreate history, but like in a lovingly or in a tongue-in-cheek way, or in kind of like a lighthearted allegory. This is one of his paintings that just exemplifies the horrible truths of what has gone on. And I think both are equally important.
Very powerful.
Very powerful.
Makes you not want to celebrate Canada Day.
Yeah, and like, and this is the kind of artwork that is hard to look at, but it's important that we don't turn away from it, because it is a very real part of history. And when we talk about artists like Paul Kane and artwork that we saw where, artists were depicting these very romanticized versions and idealized versions of the relationship between colonizers, European colonizers, and the indigenous peoples, this very image is the reason why all indigenous people are upset about the way that those images were romanticized, because this was the reality.
Erin, I've just finished reading for my book club, Five Little Indians.
Oh.
And it's about 5 teenagers who are released from the residential schools.
Mm-hmm.
And so the timing of this, like they would come to get the children on their 6th birthday.
Yeah, no, it's terrible.
And I also find it interesting that this painting is hanging in the Denver Art Museum.
Yeah, I mean, he did multiple paintings that were like, he did a sister painting like this that from a different angle, and I think that one might be in a Canadian museum, but he's right. I mean, he is one of the most famous, collected, sought after artists of this time, of today. So everybody wants his work everywhere. And this is the last piece by him. So this is the Resurgence of the People, also based on a historical painting, which I pasted in below. So this monumental installation was created for the Great Hall of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York in conjunction with the institution's 150th anniversary in 2019. So it's also important to mention that part of the reason why he's a Canadian artist, but his works are also in American museums, is because his work speaks about not only Canadian colonization, but American colonization as well. And whereas the last painting was about Canadian Confederation, this one is a remix of Washington crossing the Delaware. So it's relative to American history as well. And the reality is that when the Europeans came over, they colonized both Canada and the States. So the major issue that he takes on is not solely Canadian, it's general colonization of the Americas. So for Monkman, the commission represented the pinnacle of many years of work. It consists of 2 paintings: Welcoming the Newcomers, a visual interpretation of migration to Turtle Island, the North American continent, and Resurgence of the People, which portrays an optimistic path forward to a new future for Indigenous people. Created by a team of 10 painters under Monkman's direction, which is amazing because it's also collaborative art. It's based on photo shoots that employed about 40 models. The project represents the artist's sophisticated deployment of revisionist history painting. That's very important to his work, revisionist history. Asserting the continued relevance of representational art as a medium to deliver a message, Monkman addressed histories told through artworks in the permanent collection of the Metropolitan Museum. His works were installed in the museum's entrance hall, a symbolically charged place of arrivals and departures, and a magnet to tourists. Resurgence of the People introduces the theme of migratory agency, reflecting the diversity of the North American settler state. He describes this painting as a conversation between the arrivals and migrations and displacements of people around the world and Indigenous generosity. It's also important to note that the people now that are in the water are the white men, and the people who are helping them into the boat or saving them are the Black people and Indigenous. So now we have two artists left that are very contemporary. So the first is Ruth Cuthand. So Cuthand writes, her artist statement is entitled, "I'm not the Indian you're looking for. I was born in 1954 in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, on Plains Cree, Scottish, and Irish ancestry. I grew up in Cardston, Alberta, near the Blood Reserve, where at the age of 8, I met artist Gerald Tailfeathers and decided that I too wanted to be an artist. As a child, my first art materials included the orange paper that was discarded in the processing of the Polaroid chest x-rays that we were subjected to annually as students in routine tuberculosis screenings. They collected the peculiar smelling 18-inch squares of paper and gave them to my Anglican minister father for use in Sunday school. Early fascination with disease, First Nations living conditions, and settler-native relationships informed by childhood experiences have become key elements in my creative practice, which has encompassed printmaking, painting, drawing, photography, and beadwork. The 1876 Indian Act was passed into law as a means of to protect, civilize, and assimilate the Indian population. Today, it remains a barrier to improvement in First Nations standards of living and a paternalistic system of governance devoid of transparency. Adopting the traditional craft of beading in my recent work was a way to continue to center the Aboriginal woman in my art while addressing other issues of concern. Maintaining the anti-aesthetic principles on which my practice was founded, I have traded crudeness of style for materials and techniques that have long been denied status as serious art. This shift has allowed for me to a more sophisticated end product that capitalizes on my fascination with the attractive and repellent subject, the simultaneously beautiful and abhorrent. So this is called COVID Masks. It's a COVID mask series. Cuthand's work has long grappled with a dual mission. Her beadwork depictions of viruses, for example, invoke the colonial past using modern scientific imagery such as medical scans or viruses under a microscope. Beads were often used to trade, she explained, and while settlers brought new tools and technology from across the Atlantic Ocean, they also brought virulent non-native disease that ripped through the Indigenous population. With all its medical tinged imagery, Cuthand's work may have resonated especially well with audiences during the pandemic. She says she continued to make a living through throughout the pandemic, through her exhibitions, in part from her project COVID Mask series, in which she beads different virus images onto N95 masks. So again, this is remixing, this is reappropriating, taking something that has been so relevant in the past few years and adorning them with like beautiful beadwork of viruses that kill you. This is called Don't Breathe, Don't Drink. So in November 2011, Atawapiskat First Nation declared a housing emergency. Black mold was found to be in the houses. When we watch Homes on Homes, the room where black mold is found is blocked off from the rest of the house. People in contamination suits come in and bag the mold drywall. The area is treated. There were photographs of shacks built by band members. Some had blue tarps as roofs. This image has stayed with me. I beaded a blue tarp with greatly magnified images of black mold. The tablecloth is tilted, which is part of the installation Don't Breathe, Don't Drink. I am alarmed by the contaminated water issues that many First Nations communities face across Canada. I have beaded magnified bacterium and parasites that are found in the 94 First Nations that currently have to boil water to consume it. I have put these into resin inside glasses of all sizes and baby bottles. I wanted to visually represent these First Nations and the scope of the problem. also a very, very powerful piece. This is her brain scan series, which is similar to her COVID mask series, in which she takes different brain scan images and renders them in beadwork. So taking something as old as traditional beadwork and pairing it, coupling it with like advanced technology. And then this is the most interesting I find of her work. So this is the trading series. So beads and viruses go hand in hand, new diseases and goods that traders brought to the Americas. Trading is a series of 12 images of viruses brought by the Europeans and new disease that was brought back to Europe. The new diseases consisted of influenza, bubonic plague, measles, smallpox, et cetera, all of them that you can read here, although it was 12, but I only had room to put 8. The disease that was taken back to Europe was syphilis, which is done in quill work. And the reason why it's done in quill work rather than in beads is because the beads were brought by the Europeans to Canada, or to what became Canada. And they brought all of those other diseases, and syphilis was created here. And so it was done in beadwork, which is traditional native, which was traditional to native culture, as we saw in our first section. And so that was the disease that was brought back to Europe. So that's a metaphor for that. Beads are a visual reference to colonization. Valuable furs were traded for inexpensive beads. On the plains, beads were a valuable trade item. They replaced the method of using porcupine quills. Preparing the quills for decorating clothing was a long process that consisted of sorting the quills, preparing vegetable dyes, and flattening the quills to sew. Obviously, beads were quicker to use, covered large areas in a wide variety of colors, which we spoke about again in the first section. So this was an homage to all the diseases, as I said, that were brought and then taken back, but rendered so beautifully. And then our last artist, because we're already 9 minutes past our ending point, is Blake Ange-Coneb. So Blake is an artist and member of the Lac Seul First Nation in Northern Ontario. He paints in the woodland style popularized by renowned Anishinaabe artist Norval Morisseau, who again we saw, as you see, we're coming full circle on lots of things. While Morisseau's work often depicted traditional Indigenous myths and spirituality, Blake's work incorporates contemporary pop culture references, including The Simpsons, the late actor Betty White, and Lego figurines. The cultural mashup style earned him an unfavorable review at first, but he has since become very popular and recognized not only by a Canadian audience, but also recognized by the Canadian government. So the idea around his work is that culture is not static, and he's been able to find an audience and younger fans who connect with the same cultural touchstones as he did, while also introducing them to Woodland's painting style. According to Cree knowledge keeper Albert McLeod, insisting on immutable rules for traditional Indigenous art isn't the best path forward because its history is ever evolving and responsive to the lives and experiences of its creators. Cree knowledge, McLeod says that the history of Indigenous art is ever moving. And the idea that we spoke about in the first class of the fact that Indigenous art is not part of Canadian art history, this is sort of a mashup of bringing, and what we've seen with Kent Monkman, and now with Ruth Cuthand too, and now with Blake Ange-Coneb, is the idea of bringing the two cultures together moving forward. So this is his piece entitled "The Kith, but Indigenous," which melts together the idea of traditional art history and what it could look like if Indigenous art had been a part of art history all along, not just Canadian, but if, you know, Europeans had sort of traded techniques with like the indigenous cultures. Here's his portrait that he did of Betty White, which reaches into, you know, visual culture and reaches into cultural history, as Betty White has been a household name, not just for, you know, for a few generations now. So he's using the idea of woodlands art and applying it on very recognizable visual culture to try and bridge together the woodland art with visual culture. This is his commentary on the Trudeau government and the lack of clean water on the reserves, which we just saw. We got a story, like the underlying story from Ruth Cuthand's work, but this was created in 2021. And just around the same time, the long-term drinking water advisories affecting the First Nations, it was announced that it was going to take several years longer to fix them than previously said. And in 2015, Trudeau had promised that it would be fixed by 2021. And in 2021, he announced that it would take until at least 23, 24, if not 25, 26, to ensure long-term solutions for a sustainable water supply for the affected nations. So there were 52 long-term drinking water advisories in effect in 33 First Nations communities as of April 9th of that year. And the action plan was put on hold because of COVID-19 measures. So this was his response to that story. Here's a portrait of Gord Downie, which was gifted to Gord Downie's family. Gord Downie being the lead singer of the Tragically Hip, who died just a few years ago. But if you know anything about Gord Downie besides his music, it's that he was a very prominent advocate for the First Nations community all across Canada. And his last project before he died was to create a visual songbook telling the story of the First Nations in Canada. And just before he died, or maybe just upon his death, he created the Gord Downie Foundation, which allocates funds to First Nations artistic practices and projects. So the artist did this as a gift to his family. And this is his mural for the Royal Winnipeg Ballet. You see a picture of the artist there. He's only 32 years old and he's already accomplished so much. And he's like skyrocketing. He actually is a friend of Kent Monkman's. Kent Monkman is one of his mentors. And Monkman has helped him navigate the art industry quite a bit as he has been getting more and more popular. And then our last image that we have, so we have the portrait of Buffy St. Marie that he did. So I'm going to click this link and I don't know if it will.
Stop invited women.
Hold on a second. Stop share. I just want to, the last thing I want to do is play you one little video. And this is going to kind of culminate. Let's do this full screen. So this is his project
There are so many
with Buffy
amazing
St. Marie
things
that
to
was
learn
funded
about
by Gord
Indigenous
Downey.
people. Do you know the history of the Indigenous people of this land goes back thousands and thousands of years, way before any settler people arrived. And our Indigenous ancestors knew right where they were. They were home. They knew their surroundings and what was beyond. But the people who came from Europe didn't know where they were because they had never been here before. Well, one day in 1801, a Blackfoot man, met a European man, Peter Fiddler, who was working for the Hudson Bay Company as a surveyor. Up until then, Europeans only knew Canada as far as Hudson Bay. But Akutkomikiman drew Fiddler an accurate map showing him over 200,000 square miles of Canada unknown to Europeans, including the rivers and the mountains and the prairies, and even which people lived where. Peter Fiddler copied Akutkomikiman's map, and he brought it to the Queen of England, who was very grateful. And Akutkomikiman's map became the first map that Europeans ever saw of what we now call Middle and Western Canada. It's important, as we're learning about history, that we also talk about the solid strengths and contributions of Indigenous people. Remember that we were here first, and we're still here. Let's find our way forward together.
So that was the project between the artist and Buffy St. Marie, who Buffy St. Marie we know has been a long time advocate for the Indigenous peoples of Canada, and it was funded by the Gord Downey Foundation that Downey created as a way to promote and help the Indigenous people move forward with their projects. And so that is where we end our journey with Canadian art history, because it's a coming of full circle, and it's the idea of the fact that we've looked at all of the Canadian art history up until now, and the idea that the Indigenous artists of today are really looking at the idea of moving forward together, you know, and that is really what reconciliation is when it comes to the Indigenous people, to their culture, and also to their art. You know, it's like they want reconciliation for what has happened, but the idea that they recognize is that the only way to move forward is together. So let's now start really considering Indigenous artists as Canadian artists and moving forward with that. And so that's why I wanted to end with a kind of showcase on what our current Indigenous artists are doing. So thank you all for being part of this journey of this 7-week course. It's been great fun, and I hope you had fun too, and I hope that you learned some stuff. And
so much.
Hopefully,
so powerful.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
Powerful.
Oh, I wish the world could have heard you. You synthesize things. I mean, it's such.
I'm telling all my friends how great Canadian art is now that I never knew about before.
And so you can go back and look at the recordings whenever you like to, and except for the group of 7, which we missed. And but please feel free to go back as often as you want to and tell your friends so that they can see it too. And hopefully this will have another course sometime in the future.
Thank you so much, Erin.